That brings us to House 4066, dealing with political parties and primaries. Representative Newton is the primary author of that bill and is with us today. Representative Newton, if you want to give us a brief summary of the bill.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee members, for being here. This bill is kind of following up on our election law we did last year. We started updating our code. A lot of our election laws hadn't changed since the 90s and early 2000s. And this kind of goes toward our political parties and cleans up some language that we've had on the books for years and fixes some issues that have also arisen. Many of these political parties laws were written in the 70s, and so they've kind of become outdated and aren't being very useful in this time. So I wanted to kind of go through the changes really quickly. The first is the convention formula for delegates. This is something that's arisen as we've gone over time. We don't actually have a cap on the number of delegates that go to state conventions for the political parties. It's set by the population. So every census, they add hundreds of delegates, and this has gone on for decade after decade after decade. And so instead of just having this number never ending, this would just set a cap on it. Just like the General Assembly, we redistrict every 10 years, and this would allow 501 delegates to move around by population. Every county would be entitled to 3 beforehand so that the rural counties can keep their representation. Like I said, the 501 would move with population, so it would mirror how the House works. You have a set number, and they move around by population. Next, we have the protest hearings. This kind of starts at section 2. We actually passed part of this last year almost unanimously. Both political parties supported this bill, which moved all protest hearings to the state executive committee meetings. Right now, if it's a legislative seat or higher, so statewide, solicitor or anything like that, the state executive committee hosts the primary protest hearing. If someone does it for a countywide or under office, the county executive committee hears the protest hearing. The downside to that, it sounds like it works, but the only thing that the person does if they were to lose that hearing, if they want to appeal it, they just have to send a 1-sentence email to the state party saying, I appealed this decision. So last year, I've sit on the state executive committee of the Republican Party. We heard hearings in the last 2 elections from county offices where they heard a hearing, they lost, 60-2, and then we had to meet in Columbia, host the hearing. This would just move all the hearings to the state executive committee, skip the first step, because in reality, the first step's being skipped now anyway, or is not being used properly. And I said both party chairmen supported that last year. It creates a bond for those hearings. I know this is kind of odd to think about, but it is extremely expensive to gather the executive committee in the short time we have to do it. I think the chairman might speak to this, some dollar figures of this, but it is extremely expensive. We have to rent space that can fit up to 100 people. Remember, the executive committees of both parties have a chairman and an EC, so that's 46 times 2, plus all your statewide guys. And this is going to happen on a weekday night, usually right after the primary, especially if it's between the primary and runoff. It's going to be in that 1 week. And that's extremely expensive for the party to do. As you can imagine, renting a space, renting food is very expensive. And as I said, when we think of protest hearings, we think of a legal proceeding. This is simply a 1-sentence email that says, I want to protest my election. It doesn't matter if they show up. It doesn't matter if they walk in and say, I think the election was just wrong, and that's all their evidence. The state parties have to bear all that cost. This sets a bond so that when they do file the protest, if they win the protest, they get their money back. But if not, that bond can be used to defray the costs that the state parties use to have those meetings. And otherwise, it just gives flexibility on the time of those hearings. Right now, they're pretty lockstep of how quickly we have to go. This just gives us some flexibility. But I think the chairman probably could give a lot better detail on these than I can.
Thank you, Representative Newton, and thank you for your bringing another election bill to our attention.
It's good to see you again, Mr. Chairman.
Well, when Chairman Newton told me he was promoting me to constitutional law, he didn't tell me he was folding in election law into the process. So what turned out to be a promotion, maybe not quite as much. But with that, I believe we have Chairman McKissick who signed up to speak on 4066. So with that, Mr. Chairman, you're recognized.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Representative Newton, appreciate him taking the time to work with us to put this bill together. As he pointed out, addresses a few things that are a problem. First off, relating to the delegate formula, it is, in essence, on autopilot. and has been either since the late 60s or the early 70s, really not sure. When I first got involved in the party in the late 80s, I think we had about 650 delegates to a state convention, give or take. And now in this coming state convention, I think it's going to be about 940. And by the time you multiply that times 2 to account for alternates, you've got a small number of venues that can actually accommodate that many people effectively, plus guests, and it puts us in a situation of sometimes having to pay a lot more than we would need to host a state convention. The Democrats have the same problem. And this would, as Representative Newton pointed out, reduce the number, but then set it at a mandated proportionality that, just like the census, would change and be adjusted once every 10 years. We think that's fair, and again, would give us a lot more options in terms of venues and saving cost to the respective parties. But the second thing I think was just as important, and if not more so maybe to our candidates, and that is how the protest hearings are run. With the state of the current law, we've got an issue sometimes in some counties with, quite frankly, the level of professionalism that candidates might be able to expect in terms of how those protest hearings are run at the county level. Which inevitably, as Representative Newton points out, means that those protests get appealed to the state executive committee. And again, with a limited amount of time between a primary and a runoff, it really puts us under a crunch when we have 2 levels of that process instead of just 1. And also the fact that you've got a good number of, I would say, frivolous claims and protests that get brought forward when the candidate bringing a protest effectively has no skin in the game. And we feel that, some requiring some sort of a bond to be posted would effectively, limit the number of frivolous claims that get brought forward and hopefully speed up the process, because then we would have less appeals potentially to have to deal with. The bill also gives us a more extended window of time to actually call these meetings, because, if all these protests are going to be coming to the state executive committee, the current law, I believe, requires that they all be dealt with effectively, essentially in one day. We get called into order and can't leave until we've heard everything. Well, if we have more traffic essentially coming potentially to the state executive committee, I believe the language in that law sets up a longer window of time where we could convene, deal with 1 or 2. If we have to come back a few days later, we could do that. It just gives us more flexibility with being able to basically dispense with all the protests and make sure that everybody's case has been heard. And again, keep the frivolous claims from clogging up the system. So we wholeheartedly support this and I think it will be very, very good for the state parties, reduce a lot of cost, and again, good for our candidates to actually make sure they can get a well-heard protest and not have things unduly delayed and extra cost added to the process. So I'll take any questions if anybody has any.
Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Chairman Newton.
Move approval.
Move approval. Roll call is required and ordered.
Mr. Jordan?
Aye.
Mr. Bamberg? Mr. Moore? Mr. Newton?
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler?
4066 passes unanimously. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes our agenda for today, ahead of schedule, ironically. So thank you for being with us today, and we are adjourned.